Well, it's a good question, and it's kind of an interesting story. I was playing golf out at Burning Tree on the second hole, and Mel Laird, who had been the Secretary of Defense, who I'd worked for, came over and said, "Chuck, I think you ought to, or would you consider being the next Comptroller General?" And I said, "What's wrong with Elmer Stotts?" And he said, "Well, it's a 15-year term." That's the first time I knew it was a term. And Mel said, "It's a great job, and it's an important job," and everything like that. So I said, "Sure, Mel, I'll be happy to consider." And of course, I'd worked a lot with GAO. The Navy, when I was responsible for the liaison with the GAO when I was at the Navy, we were the biggest customers. I always said there was more GAO reports written about the Navy than any other government agency. See, and then during the 10 years I was back with Arthur Anderson, there was 2 or 3 things that I worked very closely with and that was in 1974 or 5, I think it was. We decided to do a balance sheet and a statement of the federal government, just as a research project. And so I went to see Elmer and the head of OMB and everybody like that. And they said they'd help and everything like that, so we were able to do that. And then what happened was that a few months after that, the New York City fiscal crisis happened. And Bill Simon, who was Secretary of Treasury, he got himself, because he was an old New Yorker, he'd been with Salomon Brothers, he got himself kind of anointed by the president to be the lead person to watch over New York loan agreements, see. And so anyway, when he got briefing on the financials, he said it didn't make any sense. I don't know whether they know what their financials look like. So he asked 3 firms to come in and tell them if they thought they could go up and see how the financials really were at New York City. We came with our little booklet, and the other guys never had a chance because he said, "My God, if you can do the federal government, you can do the..." So anyway, I did the New York City. I had 40 guys working up in December of 45. No, of 85. No, wait. Let me get it right. Oh, 75. 75, yeah. And so I worked on quite a few things. And then I was on the AICPA advisory board, and I was responsible for interaction with GAO. So I had quite a good background. Well, it's like being president. Eleanor Roosevelt once said on Meet the Press, the presidency has become so complicated, nobody's prepared. But the big thing is you got to have the growth capability to grow into it. My background was quite good to become Comptroller General, but it wasn't anything compared to Elmer Stotts. He knew the whole government, being head of Bureau of the Budget. But see, I knew the defense and national security area very well, which is a big advantage. 2, I had done some special assignments in my 10 years back with Anderson for the Federal Reserve, the first audit of the Federal Reserve. The Department of Interior hired us to review their financial. So I had about 5 or 6 of the agencies that I had quite good background in, and the other 10 to 15 I had to work hard and get up to speed on that. But for somebody coming in from the outside, I probably had better than most people would have had. Well, what attracted me is I figured that it was the auditors for the entire federal government. And I went back and I checked with Bob Moot. He was a controller, and he was an O-line career guy. And first they wanted me to come back and be Controller of Defense, not just Navy. He said, "Chuck, go for the GAO job. It's more important, and it's total government." And he said, "If you can get that one, I'd go for that one," he said. Well, I thought the GAO had evolved quite well over the years, and that's important for any organization. If you think about it, when they came out of Treasury, they were checking vouchers. A lot of the guys didn't even have a college education. They were just checking vouchers, see. And then when World War II came along, the vouchers arrived by the boxcar. So Lindsey Warren, who was a congressman by background, but a very talented guy, and Roosevelt's eventual choice to be Comptroller General, he figured out we had to do it a little differently. And so what he did is he hired some CPAs, and one of the professors from the University of Illinois, who I knew quite well, Breen, and they started to audit literally what was happening, and then check maybe some of the vouchers. But it was more getting to be a financial audit, maybe like a CPA firm. And when Ike put in his Comptroller General, which was Campbell, he was a CPA. He was the only CPA Ike ever knew. He was treasurer of Columbia University, and he really turned it into like a CPA firm, you know. Yeah, so it was evolving, and then Elmer Stotz comes along, and it goes after this program auditing, on the theory that, you know, checking the books and the financials is okay, but if you're wasting money on a big major weapon or something like that, that might be more interesting and better to report to Congress than the others. So when I came in, I wanted to build on top of what GAO was doing, and I thought that it was one organization that had evolved where a lot of other organizations, both in the private sector and the government, they just get stale. They just do what they've always done, and pretty soon it's obsolete. Well, the first thing I did was not make any changes for a year. I accepted the idea that there was a lot of talented people here. And one thing I learned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy when I went in there was some people at the beginning who had great ideas for me weren't so good later on after I knew the place better. So I thought with a 15-year term, I'm just going to keep it going like it is, and that. I really appreciated and was very impressed with Milt Sokolar, who was the acting Comptroller General and had been the head of the legal department. So I anointed him to be my deputy. And here's an interesting story, and that is that if you think about it, there's only two presidential appointments. There's the Comptroller General and there's the deputy. Okay, well, I'm in there about 4 months, and I get a call from the White House saying, "We found your deputy." And I said, "Really? Who's that?" And they said, "Tony Hope." And I said, "I know Tony Hope. He's Bob Hope's son." And they said, "Oh, yeah, that's right." See? And I knew Tony Hope really wasn't that strong, you know. He was a CPA. But so I explained to him that, you know, I've got a really good person over here. Maybe you could get a nut job for Tony. And so they said, well, no. And I knew Bob Hope. See, this is the Reagan administration. So Bob Hope was talking to Reagan, you know, and saying, "My son." He was an adopted boy of the Hopes. But anyway, I kind of pushed that back for a while. And then they kept coming back to me, see. And so anyway, I talked to Mel there. And Mel went over to the White House and talked to Ed Meese and a few people and said, "Look, Chuck's got a really experienced guy there. They're working well together. Why don't you get Tony another job?" See. So but then what I didn't do, and Milt was okay with this, I never sent it up for a presidential appointment. In other words, he was the deputy. He was never a presidential appointment in that place. And I think that's the way it's been ever since. I think so, yeah. After that year, I made quite a few changes because I had a good feel for the operation by that time. And that is, I wanted to get the quality of the reports done better. Not that they were bad before, but there was no standardization to them. And some people would write a 200-page report, and others would write a 50-page report. And the guys that did their 200-page thought they had a better report because it was 150 more pages, see, which wasn't true at all. And so I brought some experts in from New York. And and by this time, Cleve Corlett had joined me. And Cleve was also saying, a lot of people don't read these GAO reports. They're just too big and voluminous. So with the expertise, we got it down to where we're going to have a 10-page or less executive summary. We're going to have 50 pages or less total report, unless really exceptional. We could go more, but it had to be an exception. We changed the color of the thing like that. And then I set up a quality control review where I made some people assistant attorney generals, assistant controller generals, without ever going to the Congress to get their approval, see. So one was in charge of reports and one was in charge of operations. And then underneath, I realigned some of the divisions and I made those guys all assistant controller generals. So when they dealt with the Congress or the press or something like that, they had a proper title, see, yeah. It used to be a light blue, just like North Carolina's blue. And it had something to do with Lindsey Warren being from, I think, South Carolina or something like that. But we went to the darker blue, that's right. And then see what I did during those things. I felt we needed to do a better job in recruiting and training and promotion, because that was the Arthur Andersen model. In other words, most of the big accounting firms were from Britain and Scotland. Price Waterhouse, Pete Mark Mitchell, Coopers, they were all British firms, came to New York to watch the investments of their people's money. But Arthur Andersen and Ernst & Ernst were two American firms. And Arthur Andersen was a professor at Northwestern. And he thought that his graduates were not really being treated too well when they went with these CPA firms. And it was because the model was in England, they didn't hire college graduates. They hired high school guys, and they had an apprentice program, kind of like that, see. And the universities in this country had these business schools, and they had an accounting major and things like that. So anyway, he bought a little CPA firm in Chicago and started out in 1913. Well, when the great stock market crash came in the 30s, he wasn't very big, but the other firms had made a lot of mistakes in the accounting for the public utility industry. So all of a sudden, the big New York banks started giving Andersen quite a bit of business, especially in utilities and things like that. So anyway, he was quite a far-sighted person. Then he died in 47, and there was kind of a struggle who was going to be the next managing partner. New York thought it should be one of theirs because they were New York, but there's more partners in Chicago, so they anointed Leonard Sponchek, who was only 37 years old, who turned out to be a genius practically. Great leader. And so anyway, he put the emphasis on recruiting, training, and promotion, just and by the time I got there, it was working well, so I had the model. And so I put an emphasis, and I hired a woman by the name of Frances Garcia, who had been at Arthur Andersen. She'd had an appointment here for a while in the government, but she came in to be my recruiting, and she knew how to do it. In other words, we selected 50 colleges. We went to the best. See, during the Lindsey Warren, they didn't think they could recruit at Harvard and University of Chicago and Stanford and places like that, because it was paying just government salaries and the work wasn't that, interesting and that. But they got some very good people out of, especially out of some of those small Catholic colleges. But anyway, what we wanted was to go to the best. And so we figured out 50 colleges, and the Arthur Andersen model was you assign it to a couple partners there, which I assigned them to a couple of our leaders for Duke and for University of Virginia and Northwestern and all that. And their job was to be in touch with the school, and if they needed speakers, so pretty soon people got to know GAO. Right. See, we also put together a video of our people testifying before Congress on important issues. So we'd show that the night before. It turned it around overnight. In other words, we had all kinds of talent. And then the training, Anderson was really great at that. And I have an identical twin brother, and he went with IBM. And he came up the usual way of the salespeople. But he ended up being head of all education and training in IBM. So I had some good advisors on how to make the training better. And then the promotion thing was, you don't promote by seniority. I saw that at the Pentagon, and I couldn't change that over there because I was only there for 3.5 years. But when I came here, I decided that we're going to promote by merit. And we started that, and especially to promote into the senior executive service by merit. And just to be blunt about it, by seniority, it was all white men getting promoted. And we had just started in an era of having women and people of color, and some of them were very talented. So that began the conversion, you might say, to a more diverse GAO. Yeah. Well, the sources were that I got a group of the leadership around me, and I said, you know, the lineup you got here was done 20, 30 years ago. And you got 4 divisions at defense. I've been at defense, I know defense is defense. And so you should have different programs, but you'd have one leader at defense. See, so we consolidated 4 and made the Defense Department the biggest by far, you know. Then the accounting and that was one big major area. And then I said, now let's see the rest, you know. And we carved it up. And so we ended up with 6 or 7 divisions that were more aligned with the government at that point in time. Oh, and establishing the chief economist, I thought that was important. That was a very small group. But technology was just coming in. I tell you this story, and that is one of the things I did when I first became Comptroller General, I made an effort to go around to all the regions. And when I got to Boston, they were just moving into a new building called the Tip O'Neill Federal Government Building. And they had the usual big room of all the typists, see, just like Arthur Andersen and everybody like that. And 2 years later, the Macs showed up, the computers showed up. And, you know, in 5 years, there was no typing pool anymore, see. And so the technology was moving so fast, I figured we had to have an emphasis and a group there, yeah. And of course, coming out of the Andersen Consulting, I was used to having really top-notch computer people, yeah. That was not my idea. That was Congressman Jack Brooks. Okay. And he was the chairman of the Government Ops Committee and had long been chairman, so he had quite a bit of influence, you might say. And he said, look, we have the Inspector General area, and we have two areas. The fraud area or any of the real investigation, and then the accounting and all the other programs. How come GAO doesn't have an investigation, see? And I wasn't too keen on setting it up because I thought the Inspector Generals could do that. And I didn't want to turn it into a police force, you know, where the GAO arrives and, my God, here's the police force, you know. But anyway, I finally talked them into letting us do it on a very small basis. And we really were lucky. We hired a guy from Treasury who understood the difference. And I think he'd been with the FBI initially. But he was very good, and he wrote good reports and everything like that. So that got off to a good start. But I give Jack Brooks full credit. Well, it's because if you think back to 1929, we had the stock market crash, and then we had all the banks going out, and pretty soon we were in the Great Depression. Okay, then Roosevelt put in a few basic reforms like deposit insurance and splitting up the banking into commercial banks and investment banks. So the commercial banks took money in, paid you 3%, and loaned it out at 6%. But they didn't take a lot of risk. And so we didn't have any banks failing, see. And so all of a sudden they created this new one called the S&L. And the S&L was highly restrained, see. But then what happened was when Reagan came into power, so did some of the members of Congress, they got the Senate. I think it was the year he won the presidency. And Garn St. Germain legislation, that's right, Garn was a Republican and St. Germain was still the Democrat and like that. They passed some new laws making reducing the restrictions, you might say, on the S&L industry. And in the old days, the S&L could only loan out money, mostly mortgages to homeowners in a certain area, even like in Chicago. You'd have somebody that has this area, then another area, then another area. See, highly restricted. Well, the Sarn-Gage-Germain took that all away. If you wanted to loan to some country club in Memphis, Tennessee, you could do that, see. Well, a few of the S&Ls got out of control. And of course, you had a dip at that time, see. And so anyway, the S&L industry was all of a sudden in big trouble, and we were the auditors for FSLIC. And what we saw was that it was about 50 million in the FSLIC account. All of a sudden it was 40, all of a sudden it was 30, 20, because you were having to pay off for the S&Ls that were going under, see. So we reported to the Congress at first. We were the first ones to report, this is a big problem coming. And so needless to say, the S&L lobbyists said, oh no, don't worry. But it soon came at a pretty strong pace. And the Congress had to vote 50 million addition into the thing every 6 months for a couple of years, see. Well, by that time, they were damn scared. And so anyway, they asked us, we were the monitors. Like, in 08, 09, the Treasury set up a separate monitor. But in the S&L crisis, it was GAO. And then I was on a lot of the Sunday talk shows, explaining what was happening, how it was happening, and everything like that. And there was a guy that came to be head of FSLIC who understood, and he was a CPA by background. Seidman was his name. So we worked very closely together. But anyway, it put us in a very high-profile role on one of the most important issues for the next 3 or 4 years in the country. Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember how that ended. Did Congress bail out?
They did. They closed a lot of them, and then they bailed out. They moved the assets to another S&L, and it would facilitate a new consolidation. But 1,000 S&Ls closed, if my number is right. I'm not sure about that. But it was a very big number of S&Ls and a couple of big ones here in Washington, D.C. Yeah. Yeah, why they were important was that when you had the Budget and Accounting Act in 1921, see, everything was in Treasury. Alexander Hamilton had put the budget in, the auditing, the counting, everything that had a dollar sign on it was in Treasury. And Teddy Roosevelt came along and said, when he was governor of New York, the budget guy reported directly to him. He didn't go through the Treasury or the finance office or anything like that. So he started a movement working with some influential members of the Senate to have the Budget Bureau come out of the out of the Treasury and report to the president. And while they were debating that, some of the senators said, well, maybe we should have the auditors come out too, and they can report directly to Congress because they'll tell us how the money was spent. Teddy's going to have more influence on how the money gets set up and approved, but how is it really spent? That's the auditor, see. So they created this concept of a GAO in that legislation. And then, much to everybody's surprise, when they got it passed, Wilson vetoed it. And he was very sick from a stroke and everything like that at the end. Some people think the doctor or his wife wrote the veto thing, but I haven't read it. I think it was somebody else might have been doing the writing, but it was Wilson. And one of the things he objected to was the 15-year term, see. So anyway, what happened then was that when Harding came in, Dawes was his budget director, but he didn't report to him, see, and Dawes was very famous. He had been the logistics guy for World War I, see. He later went on to be vice president. And so he thought, you know, Teddy Roosevelt had a good idea. So anyway, they changed the 15-year term, to ask some GAO person, let me get this straight. If a Comptroller General wasn't doing the right thing, the original legislation said a concurrent resolution by the Congress, he could be removed. The newer one said it had to include the president's signature, see? But they passed that. So then what happened was the auditors all came over and started this new thing called the GAO. But they didn't really issue a financial report at the end of the year. And that's the way it was when I got there. And John Glenn now was the big advocate of this, where Jack Brooks had been the advocate for the thing. John Glenn was the chairman of the Senate Affairs Committee, you know. And he said, you know, I was in the private sector after I went to the moon, and he didn't go to the moon, after he circled the Earth. And he said, we always have a financial statement and it's audited. So why shouldn't the federal government have it? And I said, that's a good question. And I showed him our little booklet on the federal government, see. And he said, this is what we should have, see. Well, a lot of people didn't want that. So we didn't get it immediately. And then what happened was that Jim Baker, who had been chief of staff under Reagan, got to be Treasury Secretary under Bush 1, see. And he brought Darman along with him, and then eventually Darman became head of OMB. But they were very close. And I got a call one day from Darman saying, Chuck, we think we are going to have to do something better to get control of the budget. Because, see, the budget was out of control because of this supply-side economics that Reagan had bought into. When you think about it, when Reagan came in, the debt of the government was less than $1 trillion. When George Bush left at the end of 12 years, it was $4 trillion. We could handle $4 trillion, but that was a hell of an increase as far as percentage-wise, see. And so I used to go over once a year and tell Baker and Darman, the Treasury, it's not working, you know. And they would say to me, well, you're right, we know you're right, but we got other things like a tax bill and things like that to worry about, you know. But anyway, out of the blue, Darman calls me and says, you know, Bush is going to win re-election. We thought we'd better get our finances in order for this last year to look like we're doing something. So that's what they did, and they passed the Chief Financial Officer Act. And one big mistake, I think, and that is Darman wanted to be the Chief Financial Officer, but he shouldn't be. He's the budget director. And I said it should be the Secretary of Treasury. And Glenn agreed with me, But he said Darman is not going to support the bill unless he gets to be CFO. So he's CFO, and all of his successors are CFO. I still think someday the Treasury Secretary should be the CFO. Yeah.
It's an important legacy from that legislation, right?
Yes. It was one of the major pieces of legislation that I was involved in. And then I got it all set up with the Accounting Standards Board. I even got in the private sector. They had the FASB. I got the GASB for all the state and local government. And that really spread all over the country. And of course, having done the New York City thing, I could explain to them why it would be a good thing to have because that was a requirement for New York City, was to have an annual budget, financial report at the end of the year and have an audit committee and everything like that.
Well, you also developed a very successful report that GAO still continues to issue every 2 years, the high risk list.
Yes.
Brings attention to federal areas vulnerable to waste, fraud, abuse, management, meaning transformation. What are your views on the importance of the high risk list?
Well, I think it's very important because, when you issue a couple hundred GAO reports and you have everybody testifying, not only GAO, but a lot of people and everything like that, why sometimes it's hard for the public in the country or the members of Congress to know what's the high-risk areas. In other words, what are the really high-risk areas that we should be worrying about? What was interesting is when they would change administration, the next administration loved this report because right away they had a map, you might say, is what were some of the problems. So I thought that was very important, and that was a GAO initiative. And Glenn supported that again, yeah. Well, what brought about was a greater interrelationship between those program directors and the committees. And once they heard what we thought was important, lots of times they'd say, I'd like to request that. See? And it was good that they liked to request it because that meant we were going to have a testimony on it, So that was something that I thought worked out very well, yeah. No question about it, yes, absolutely. And it also brought a lot more press coverage because with more hearings, you get more press coverage. And then I don't know whether you have this as a question, but at one point another change we made to the report is we put the name of the person who headed up the job in the back with their telephone number. And the press didn't have to call the public affairs office like they do in practically every government agency. They could go directly to there. And of course, we were told everybody, if you got a problem, get a hold of Cleve. But we don't want everybody to, and one time I was on an airplane long after I was left GAO, and there was a guy from the Chicago Tribune next to me, and he said, well, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I'm a CPA and I'm on a lot of boards. And he said, that name is familiar, Bowsher. And I said, well, I was Comptroller, that's where it's from. He said, Bowsher, yeah, you were Comptroller General. He said, we used to love those reports because he said if it was an interesting story, why, we just call the head guy and he'd tell us what the key things were. When you're promoting people into the senior executive service, you can't just promote somebody that knows how to write a good report. He's got to be able to communicate a good report, both to Congress, to the press, and everybody else. See? And not everybody that majors in accounting or a few other disciplines have that skill. But it's important. Well, that was a surprise to me. I had no idea there was anything called INTOSAI. In my first year there, I got to know a little more about it, didn't spend a lot of time on it. Then I went out to the Philippines. They were hosting it that year. And I saw all the other auditors general, see. And I saw how they all were, and Elmer had become a leader in it. He had the magazine. He would host anybody that came to Washington, you know. And so I thought it'd take me quite a while before I would have the same respect as Elmer did because, you know, his background and everything like that. But just being the Comptroller General from the United States, I immediately was accepted as a leader and everything like that. And so anyway, when I got done with that trip and that visit, I said to myself, by God, this is important because one, you get to know what's happening around the world, and we spend a lot of money around the world. Two, I could call any auditor general and find out what's happening in Pakistan. And as one guy once said to me, next to the CIA, you have the best network, Chuck, in the world. And he was right. He was absolutely right. Then what happened is a lot of them kept coming here to Washington to see how we did our work. And then there was another thing that was fascinating, and that is I thought quite a few of them came because their children were in universities in America. And so this way they could see their children, see that, then stop by and see us, and I expect write it off, you know. Yeah, yeah. Well, that was a terrible thing that happened, and I give Newt Gingrich full credit for being such a dumb guy to reduce the size of GAO. GAO was 5,200 when I got there, and I worked with Vic Fazio. He was a congressman from California, and a guy by the name of Lewis. They were both from California, one Republican, one Democrat. And I said, if you just give me stability, I will run you a great GAO organization, but if you keep cutting me and up, down, and that. So anyway, we had a system where I would always request 100 more seats, you know, and pay the spaces, and they'd go to the floor and say, GAO is doing a terrific job, but we don't think you need 100. We're going to ask them to be a little more efficient and everything like that. And so we stayed at 5,200 for 13 years. Then this goofy Newt Gingrich came in, and he had run against what he called a $1 billion Congress, and that was the budget of the legislative branch. See, and he was going to cut it big time if he got them. Well, he won. And then he started to say to all the chairmen of the committee, we're going to cut your staffs. And they said, no, we just got the power, my friend. We don't. So then he looked around and saw that there was GAO, the CBO, the Library of Congress, and a scientific advisory group that was in the legislature. So he, without ever calling or consulting, he announces to the world he's going to cut the GAO in half. And luckily, I'd been there for 13 years. I had a lot of friends on the Hill. And so we prevented that from happening. But our compromise was we would go down over a few years. And then I thought going down was a huge mistake. I still think it is, because if you look at Price Waterhouse in New York, they got 5,000 people there for the city of New York and their area. And we got, what do we got now, 3,500 or something like that? For the whole federal government, the whole nation, you know. 3,100, yeah, ridiculous. When I got there, well, go back to when they built the building. It was early 50s, and they put asbestos in all the piping and ducts and everything like that, because like they did that in the wartime in the ships and things like that, because it was asbestos and it would keep fires from spreading, see. What they didn't know is asbestos would deteriorate and become a lung problem for people that like that. When I got there, they took me down to where the lawyers were, and they would say, look, I'm going home tonight, and my desk is clean. I'd like you to come down tomorrow morning when I arrive, and you'll see white powder all over this desk. And so, having had the Navy job, I was very familiar with asbestos on the ships because the Navy was starting to wise up to it. So anyway, I found a guy through the Navy who was an expert in this area and had been a career Navy guy, but he had formed a firm, and I had him come over. And he said, oh, God, you got to do something about it. He said, this is awful, see. So then one of my top guys said we ought to give up the building. But there's a problem with that because then you're in a GSA rented building, and sometimes they don't maintain it too well. Sometimes they want you to move, like the SEC's moved about 4 or 5 times since that. So I talked with Dick Brown, who was a terrific guy. He was our budget officer, but he also was kind of in charge of the building stuff. And he agreed with me. And then we went over and saw the Congress, and they agreed with us. So we decided we'd take the asbestos out floor by floor. That's what the Navy guy recommended. And as long as we were doing that, then we would put in proper offices because, see, the building was built for those voucher checking guys, desk to desk. I wanted to look like Arthur Anderson of Price Waterhouse. So that's why I got the architects to design and that. Also, what I found when I first got there is that anytime anybody moved, they would bring in carpenters and they'd change. So there wasn't three offices alike, see. And I said, no, what you do is you have an office for a certain level thing, a little bigger for the next one, some conference rooms and everything like that. And so that became our model. And then Jack Brooks came along and said, while you're doing this, why don't you put in one of these physical education or athletic areas? He said, that's the rage now. And also something for the children. There's going to be more women. And with Jack Brooks' support, I quickly adopted that. And so that was all part of the renovation. And I really do believe, I give Dick Brown all the credit in the world. He got the money through the appropriations, and he worked with the contractors. And the interesting thing was our general contractor had to be the Corps of Engineers. And when they saw what the finished product looked like, they moved in. The Bureau of Labor Statistics had been in their space, and they had to leave because we were doing the renovation. And the Corps of Engineers just bumped them out. And, and so that was a tribute to how well we did that building. Well, what I wanted to do was I wanted to hire the best and the brightest. I've talked to you about how we did that with Francis Garcia's leadership. Then we wanted to have good training. And because a lot of organizations don't train their people well. And my twin brother was especially keen on this because IBM did a terrific job of training their people and everything. So I just kind of raised that with everybody, and everybody thought it was a good idea. And see, we were getting a terrific number of people. And I think you are today still getting really top-notch people. The derivatives report is really one of the great reports we ever issued, which was totally ignored until the crisis came in 08, 09. And that was because J.P. Morgan and a few of the big banks put on a really big campaign to say, look, don't worry about that GO report. Derivatives, there's nothing worrisome about that, see. The Columbia University Journalism School did a program after everything fell apart that really, a lot of people have never read it, but they describe how well the GAO alerted everybody to the problem and how nobody did anything in the problem because the lobbyists from the big banks and everybody else worked so hard. But of course, when it all blew up, because AIG and a lot of those outfits had derivatives was really part of the problem. And I give the Chicago office a lot of credit. They were the ones that took the lead on that report because the Board of Trade was out there and things like that. And so that became what I always thought was one of our most important. When we testified on that, there was guys from Scotland even flew in to hear the testimony. We had 50,000 requests for the report after we testified. See, it had to be in the early 90s. Yeah, it was not after 90. This was all part of the civil rights movement and the nation, because when I left Arthur Andersen, they were an all-white male too, and they were starting to hire, and I was involved in, because I knew some good black graduates from the University of Chicago and things like that. And the women, you know, when I was a county major at the University of Illinois, we had 2 women in the county major program. 3 years later, one of the women that was in the program won the gold medal for the highest mark in the CPA exam, and none of them got any offers from the accounting firm, see, and that. So I was aware of the problem, and I was aware that there was a lot of talent among the women, and they were coming more and more. They were rising in the numbers of the business school, the law schools, and medical schools, and things like that. So that was an easy change that everybody agreed with at GAO. And, you know, it was slow going at first, but now I think you got half the staff is women and a good proportion of people of color. Yeah. Well, I think I'm particularly proud of the way our people eventually became so good at not only writing the report, but presenting the report. See, we went up to something like 200 to 300 hearings a year. You'll have to check that number, but it's in that range, I think. And when Elmer Satz took over, it was 15 a year. And he bumped it up to 75 or 80 or something like that, see. But the only way you could do that is when you delegated it down to those 30. And see, the big thing in the private auditing firms is once you're a partner, you can sign the partner's name. The senior partner in charge of Chicago doesn't run out and sign the name of everything. And so that was the model, you might say. And I was so pleased because some of my people really became outstanding. And they were on Meet the Press in the morning, and Meet the Press, but also the Today Show in the morning and everything like that. And of course, Cleve Corlett was terrific as a press guy. He had been with Chafee and Church on the Senate side. And so he knew the Congress, he knew the people in the journalism world. He had been with AP, his first job, you know, and he was terrific. I suspect maybe, if I look back, I think that we maybe should have moved a lot faster on some of the emerging issues. Now, we moved faster than everybody else thought we were moving fast. But the truth of the matter is you have to evolve. You know, a lot of organizations go out of business in the nonprofit area, in the business world, because they don't evolve. And just to give you this statistic, when I joined Andersen in '56 and I made partner in '67, I had about 20 different clients, maybe 25. They're all gone but 2, Walgreens and the Catholic Church. Wow. See? So that just shows how the world changes in the business world. Then if you look at the healthcare area today, I go to the Mayo Clinic. We have the greatest medical centers in the world, but we have some of the poorest medical centers in the world. And one of the reasons we have some of the poorest is that those are hospitals and doctors that don't want to change, you know. So I think you really have to evolve, and maybe we could have done it even faster. I worked I figured out who were the leaders and who were the thinkers that wanted to make change, and I worked very closely with them, and I promoted them. And so pretty soon, we were working as a team, which was important because that's the way the Arthur Anderson people worked. And change wasn't hard to. I never changed anything unless I got agreement with people. In other words, I never came in and says, "Look, I know how to do this. This is how we're going to do it." I always said, "This is how it has been done. Let's pull together 4 or 5 of us here and think it through." Yeah. Well, that's very interesting because I thought I'd go on a few boards because that's what Elmer did. And so I got invited on to 4 or 5, 6, but it was slow going because they had decided all of a sudden that too many old guys were on the boards of the big corporation and everything like that. And see, I was 65, going on 66 when I retired in that. So, but once you get on some, then they see you as the chairman of the audit committee pretty soon in that. And anyway, I ended up serving on 25 boards, 10 corporate, 10 nonprofits, and 5 universities in the next 25 years. Next 20 years, yeah. And so it was a marvelous career, and I really became quite wealthy. See, when I left Anderson to become Comptroller General, I was making $265,000, and I went down to $65,000, see. And so I had a lot of partners say, "What are you doing?" I had a twin brother who said, "What are you doing?" But I always figured if you did a good job, there would be a future out there. And when I left the Navy job, I always remember this. Admiral Rickover came to see me. And I don't know whether you know the history of Rickover, but practically everybody does. He built the nuclear navy, the nuclear submarines, but he was a miserable little character, see. And so anyway, he had a mixed audience in the Pentagon, let me tell you, but everybody respected him, and the same with the Congress, see. And so he came to me and he said to me, "Why are you leaving?" And I said, "Well, I've got 2 children. I got to get enough money to send them to college, everything like." The truth of the matter is, I was a Democrat from Chicago, and I got wind of the fact that if Nixon won again, he wasn't going to, all the Democrats were going to go gone, see. So I figured I might as well go first. And Chafee was leaving, see. And so anyway, that was my real reason, but I told him this, and he said, "Oh, come on," he said, "a guy of your ability, you're never going to have to worry about money," And I thought he was just trying to con me into staying, but he was right. He was right. Yeah. Yeah, I would like to be remembered is that we evolved and modernized, and I think when Elmer was there, GAO was already the top national auditing organization in the world. They improved watching us, but I think we were, without question, we were the number one when I left there. So I carried on what Elmer had achieved. And I think that, and we helped a lot. Like when China they sent 15 people over here all wearing their Mao uniform to figure out how they do it, They stayed for weeks. We gave them all kinds of paper and everything like that. And the fascinating thing now is sometimes when they come, I host them here for lunch at the thing like that. They look like they stopped in Bond Street in London to get their books. They all speak English. Some of them went to American universities. And in that first 15, nobody spoke English, So I'm really impressed about how China has moved. And in the auditing, we were their mentor. And it's same with when the Berlin Wall went down. I was invited to Hungary on my way to Berlin because they were going to hold the INTOSAI meeting there. And honest to God, I was treated like a rock star or a Hollywood star. We came down on the boat from Vienna, and we docked, they announced that everybody should stay seated till Mr. Bowsher and Mrs. Bowsher got off the boat. We got, they had a band, they had flowers, they had everything. And I was at national TV and everything like that, because they wanted to recreate the audit function, which they had before the communists took over. And we worked with Hungary, Poland, all those countries, and that was a big contribution by GAO. Yeah. And also, I was very proud of how I selected the people. I think the GAO team, when I left there, was just first rate, you know. And I'm talking about the top 50, yeah. Yeah, there is one thing I want to say, can I say? And that is that in the Bowsher book, and even today, I mentioned a few people, but there really was a lot of dedicated people at GAO that made it great. And so it wasn't Chuck Bowsher alone by any stretch of imagination, yeah. And see, I had watched at the Navy. In other words, think of how many people graduate from the Naval Academy every year. Other people graduate from Notre Dame and schools like that in NR2. Then they have an OCS. They have the best of the cream of the crop, right? Okay, they jokingly, when they graduate from the Naval Academy, they kind of try to see which 5 might be full admirals, 30 or 40 years like that. They never guess right. And, but the Navy works very hard at promoting by merit and getting top-notch people, because in time of war, that's crucial. For one thing, the good people and the younger people took ownership. Nat Gandhi, who you probably know, was the CFO of the district, and he worked for me for 15 years. He's a real talent. And he says, he just wrote his book. He said he came to America with $7 in his pocket, leaving the family behind. He got a job, he was an accounting major out in India. So he got a job teaching at a fairly modest school in the South, got the University of Pittsburgh. And then he heard about GAO, and he came down just to do a special thing. He liked GAO, so he got hired, see? And he rose to be one of my top guys. He was terrific. And then when the district got into trouble for about the 3rd time, I was gone by then, they brought him in to be CFO and everything like that. But in his book, he says, if Chuck Bowsher hadn't become Comptroller General, I never had any idea I'd get to be the senior executive service, you know. And so those guys really appreciated. I suspect a few that didn't make it weren't quite as complimentary. Yeah. Let's put it that way. Yeah. Yeah, they were very effective. I inherited these from Elmer. He had started them. And of course, some of the people were about Elmer's age, and so some of them retired from the board before I even got there, or just shortly thereafter. So I had the opportunity to bring in some new talent. But the advisory board, when we finished bringing in new talent, it looked like a cabinet out of power. In other words, I had the Secretary of Defense, that was Laird. I had Elliot Richardson. I had, I'm sure I had 6 or 7 former cabinet officers. I had Admiral Pete from the Navy and Admiral Kent Lee, and they knew a lot about major weapon systems like airplanes and missiles and things like that. And what I would use them for, they'd meet twice a year, but what I'd use them for sometimes, if we were doing a report on the B-2 bomber, I'd send them to see Admiral Kent Lee. Well, then pretty soon, when they were doing maybe the next one, they didn't wait for me. They went to Admiral Kent Lee, see, and got advice. Also, he had Jimmy Weinberg on the board and he was the older brother to John Weinberg, who was the Goldman Sachs guy. So, and then I had a great friend at Lazard Brothers. So we had Wall Street. we really had a terrific team. And then we'd meet twice a year, and I'd always have a great speaker. Like I had Clark Clifford one time speak on the transition because he had run the Kennedy transition. And I remember Jimmy Weinberg saying to me, you know, I serve on a lot of boards, but he said the one I never miss is this one, because you're working on the biggest issues and you got such interesting, yeah. So that, and eventually, as I say, my people got to where they call those guys up, and yeah. Now the education was a very talented group too, and they also helped in the recruiting. In other words, there was a guy from Stanford University. He even brought in his class when he came to visit Washington. GO was a stop. See, well, needless to say, when we went to Stanford, we had a lot of people turn out. He'd tell us which ones were the best, and so that was a very good team. And a guy from Princeton, Professor Bressler, he was a leader. He loved being the leader of that group. Yeah, yeah.